This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order Dominaria United right now by going to cardkingdom.com/needsahone or following the link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Needsahone, and today I'm bringing you my Dominaria United Archetype Guide. Over the last week or so, I've given you my thoughts on every single card in the set, and I'm concluding my review of the new format with a look at the archetypes for each of the 10 color pairs within this set. This video is about the internal synergies within the various color pairs, so I'm not going to be talking about cards that are just super good everywhere, like premium removal or bombs, unless they have some special synergy within a particular deck. If you're interested in hearing about all of those cards, that's what the set review is for. This format is fairly typical in that it has 10 supported 2-color archetypes, although as we'll see, there are lots of overlapping themes that will lead to most decks being 2 colors and splashing a third, and some decks may even be able to go full-on 3 or more colors. There's also an 11th archetype in the format that is built around defenders, and we'll talk about that too. So we're going to start by looking at spell decks. There are 3 different decks in the format really focused on spells. All 3 of them are blue decks, and this shows you some of the overlap that can occur in terms of synergy. This time around, they didn't just give us a signpost uncommon. You know, in most sets we get one signpost uncommon, and it's a card that sort of tells you the direction you're supposed to go in. In this format, every color pair has 2 legendary creatures that are 2 colors, and so you have 2 signpost uncommons straight up. But then on top of that, there are also 2 commons and 2 uncommons with off-color kicker in the color of the other color within a color pair. So you kind of have 4 signpost uncommons and 2 signpost commons. So it's pretty interesting that they went that deep on these types of synergies. Although, as we'll see, not all the cards in each of these color pairs that are among these signpost commons and uncommons synergizes perfectly with what the color pair is doing. So anyway, blue-red this time around is a spell deck. It often is. And it's a spell deck that looks like it can lean more aggressive than in the control direction, but I do think there are things around that allow you to do both. The 2 signpost uncommon creatures you have are Balmor Battlemage Captain, who gives +1/+0 and trample to your whole board every time you cast an instant or sorcery. That is quite strong. And the other is Najal the Stormrunner, who is a 5-mana 5/4 that makes your sorcery spells castable as if they had flash, and when you attack with Najal, you can pay 2, and if you do, it copies your next instant or sorcery spell this turn. So obviously both of those really want you to be playing a bunch of instants and sorceries. You've also got Gitu Amplifier as one of these signpost commons. It gets +2/+0 anytime you cast an instant or sorcery, on top of the fact that it can bounce stuff when you kick it. You've got Fires of Victory, an instant that is red and has a blue kicker that does damage equal to the number of cards in your hand, and if you kick it, it can draw you a card. You also have Battle Wing Mystic. This is the one that doesn't say, or isn't a spell and doesn't say instant or sorcery anywhere on it, but it is a pretty good card, this 2-mana 2/1 flyer that when you kick it, you can discard your hand and draw 2 cards. So it'll help you sort of reload your hand in the later game. You've also got Timely Interference, a nice cheap 1-mana spell that replaces itself, and that goes really well with Gitu Amplifier and Balmor, who really like you to cast as many spells as possible, and if you are basically cycling a spell and getting a trigger, good chance you can trigger things more than once. It also has a decent effect. The effect won't come up that much, but the times where you can actually make Timely Interference do something in addition to replacing itself, it will feel pretty great. So let's look now at the other common and uncommon spell payoffs. So there's of course Balmor, we have our Amplifier, Najal, but then there's also Electrostatic Infantry, which is a 2-mana 1/2 that gets a +1/+1 counter anytime you cast an instant or sorcery, and it has trample, so it's a pretty aggressive spell payoff, just like Gitu Amplifier. These are 2 2-drops that really make me feel that, combined with Balmor, really makes me feel like this deck can be really aggressive if you end up with the right build. And yeah, there's going to be some scary starts to games where those 3 2-drops are around. You know, some combination of them is around and you're just casting cheap spells and doing tons of damage. Twinferno lets you copy instant or sorcery spells. Also has an additional mode where you can give something double strike. Academy Wall lets you loot every time you cast an instant or sorcery. It seems less well suited to this particular spell deck. There's another one of the spell decks where I think this is better. but it is an instant or sorcery payoff. Djinn of the Fountain is a 6 mana 4/4 with flying that anytime you cast an instant or sorcery spell, gives you some options. It seems like in this deck, if you're leaning more aggressive, you're probably going to be pumping it more than anything, but the other modes are nice. Founding the Third Path, this is another one that I feel is probably more well-suited to some of the less aggressive spell decks. And really, there's only one that isn't aggressive at all, and that's blue-black. And this is probably more suited to that deck, because that deck also likes the graveyard. But it is another spell payoff. Micromancer is pretty cool. It lets you add to the board. A 4-mana 3/3 is not great, but it is a creature. And it lets you search up a cheap spell. Obviously, you need to have some spells that cost 1, but there are enough of them. And obviously, you can play her and then cast a spell you get frequently, which will trigger some stuff, which is pretty cool. Tolarian Terror is cheaper to cost for each instant or sorcery in your graveyard. And Volshe Tide Turner lets you cast spells more easily that are instants or sorceries or have kicker. And Haunting Figment becomes unblockable when you cast instants or sorceries. It's another one of these 2-drops that really makes me feel like there really may be a variant of the blue-red deck where you have like all of these aggressive 2-drops that like spells, and you run like 16 lands and a bunch of cheap spells. It looks like a real thing. At the same time, I think the deck can lean a little more controlling. Najal isn't exactly an aggressive card, for example, but it does feel like the blue-red deck's going to lean a little more into aggressive territory than maybe we're used to seeing in most formats. What are some of the rares that fit well here? Well, you've got Haughty Djinn, who has power and toughness each equal to the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard and reduces the cost of instants and sorceries. You have Jaya, Fiery Negotiator, who creates monk tokens that have prowess. Prowess is a spell payoff. Anytime you cast a non-creature spell, they get +1/+1. In addition to that, she's just a really powerful planeswalker who will be good in any red deck, but the prowess tokens are extra good here. And you also have Keldon Flame Sage, a creature with Enlist, and when it attacks, you get to look at the top X cards of your library, where X is its power, and you can cast an instant or sorcery from among them for free if it's X or less. And, some of these creatures whose power goes up when you cast stuff could be pretty sweet to use Enlist with Keldon Flame Sage, because then you're probably casting a spell for free. So that's the blue-red deck. It's a fairly aggressive variant of the spell deck. Let's move now to blue-black, which is a much more controlling deck. This is really a control spell deck that has a graveyard theme. Our 2 signpost uncommons here are Rona, Sheoldred's Faithful, and Vohar, Vodalian Desecrator. Rona, anytime you cast an instant or sorcery spell, makes your opponent lose 1 life, and she can also come back from the graveyard later in the game. And Vohar, Vodalian Desecrator lets you loot, and anytime you discard an instant or sorcery with that loot effect, you get to drain 1 life from your opponent, and Vohar can also sacrifice itself to cast instants or sorceries from the graveyard. Then your kicker cards include Rona's Vortex, a really cheap way to bounce a creature, and if you kick it, you even get to put that card on the bottom of their library. You've got Phyrexian Espionage, a card that's basically divination, which is kind of nice in spell decks anyway, but if you kick it, you also make your opponent discard. Monstrous Warleech mills you, which this deck likes to set up. If you can mill your Rona, it's almost like you're not really milling her because you can get her back later, and there's lots of other reasons you want to be milling yourself in the format too. And then there's Tribute to Urborg, a powerful common that has sort of a baseline of a decent removal spell, and then when you kick it, it also gives -1/-1 until end of turn for each instant sorcery card in your graveyard. So there's another reason to mill yourself. So what spell payoffs do we have here? Well, we have the 3 that we've really already seen. We've also got Academy Wall, which I think is more suited to this deck. As we've seen, this deck is more interested in making the game go long, so a creature that can't attack is more appealing, and it's more interested in putting things in the graveyard, and Academy Wall does that too. I think Djinn of the Fountain might also be more well-suited to this particular deck, because it's a 6-drop. It's a slower card that sort of grinds out value over time. Founding of the Third Path, we saw this earlier. Again, I think it's probably better here, mostly because Chapter 2 mills you, and Chapter 3 lets you cast an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard. Micromancer, nice here, just like it was in blue-red. Tolarian Terror, probably also a little better here than it is in a blue-red deck, because it wants spells in your graveyard to reduce its cost. Volshe Tide Turner, again, lets you add blue, and you can spend mana only to cast instants or sorceries, and then also Haunting Figment. So This is an interesting thing with the format. You'll notice here there isn't really a single mono black spell payoff. We have the 2 signpost uncommons and then a card with blue kicker. So we've already seen all of this spell stuff that is also graveyard stuff, but in addition to that, there's also Eerie Soul Tender, which mills you when it enters and lets you return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand if it goes to your graveyard, and Monstrous War Leech, which mills you, which we saw earlier. So what rares fit in here? Well, again, Haughty Djinn is good here, decreases the cost of your spells. Again, might be a little better here because you're going to be milling yourself more, so more spells will be in your graveyard. And then you also have Cruelty of Gix, which has a chapter 3 that lets you reanimate something, so I included it here since you're going to be milling yourself. And the last of these really spell-heavy decks is Blue-White, which is a go-wide deck. White this time around is about going wide, blue still about spells, and so when you put them together, this is what you get. And you have 2 signpost uncommons who do a very good job of representing that fact. Wrath Weatherlight Stalwart lets you draw a card when you cast an instant or sorcery spell if you tap 2 untapped creatures you control, and you can pay 3 generic and 2 white to buff the whole board and give it vigilance. Meanwhile, Tura Kenurid Sky Knight gives you a 1/1 white soldier creature token anytime you cast an instant or sorcery, and then it's no surprise that every one of these cards with kicker is either an instant or sorcery. You have Tolarian Geyser, which lets you bounce something. If you kick it, you can gain life. The most signposty of these 4 kicker cards is definitely Protect the Negotiators, because it's a spell that gives you a token and it's a better counterspell the more creatures you control. Runic Shot gives you a really efficient way to kill tapped creatures, which, anytime you can pay 1 and trigger stuff like these 2 signposts, it's going to feel pretty good. And Stall for Time lets you shut down a couple of creatures for a few turns if you kick it, and it also replaces itself, something we've already said is good in spell decks. So, spell payoffs, well, we've got these 2 that we've already seen, and then several other cards we've already seen as well. These blue cards all slot in nicely here. I mean, again, this deck is more aggressive, so Academy Wall and Founding the Third Path are maybe not amazing, but they're probably a little better here than they are in blue-red. This deck does feel a little less aggressive, like it sort of wants to build its advantage by making these tokens and stuff a little more slowly. But yeah, spell payoffs that we've already seen. So what's the going wide angle? Well, I think one of the key cards for this deck is going to be Captain's Call, and that's because it's a spell that makes 3 soldier tokens. So this deck wants to go wide, and it wants to cast spells. This is one of the few cards at common or uncommon in the whole set that is both a spell and makes tokens, and luckily it's common. But I think this card's really going to overperform in this deck because it'll trigger your stuff and then also add to the board, and then you have this go wide angle where you want all these extra bodies so that Raph can draw you cards, and so when Raph pumps the whole board, things are better and stuff like that. You've also just got a bunch of white cards that make more than 1 body, like Argivian Cavalier here, which gives you a 1/1 in addition to its 2/2 body. Argivian Phalanx is a go-wide payoff, so if you've managed to make some tokens, you can cast this more cheaply. Resolute Reinforcements gives you 2 bodies. This card's kind of interesting because it's basically Raise the Alarm, but it's not a spell, and it almost makes me think that Raise the Alarm was like too good in this format because, spells and going wide is what this deck wants to do, so they decided to make it a creature instead. It's pretty interesting they didn't just print Raise the Alarm, that's all I'm saying. Charismatic Vanguard can pump your whole board. Griffin Protector gets a token or a +1/+1 counter anytime a creature enters the battlefield. And Heroic Charge, it does have red in its cost, but splashing a 3rd color is going to be a thing in this format a lot. You can already see how a blue-white-red deck would work together. You have one of the blue-red signposts pumps the whole board. This deck wants to go wide. It all sort of slides together pretty easily, at least as a splash. So splashing red to make Heroic Charge extra good is definitely a thing. And yeah, the only real go wide payoff in blue is Protect the Negotiators, which is basically not really mono blue. So what are the rares here? Again, we've got Haughty Djinn. There's also Defiler of Faith, who can make soldier tokens, Ether Channeler, which can make a 1/1 bird token, and Valiant Veteran, who likes soldiers, and all the tokens that you want to be making in this color pair happen to be soldiers, so Valiant Veteran slots in really well. So those are the 3 really spell-heavy decks. You can see how they all overlap with each other. You're often going to be playing, sort of have one of these color pairs as your core, but then be splashing a 3rd color to pay the off-color kicker costs on some of the other cards and stuff like that. And maybe even for signpost uncommons, since they all really synergize well together. So now let's move From this Go Wide deck to another one, which is Black-White, which has the Go Wide theme, of course, because it has white in it, but it's also a sacrifice deck. So basically, this deck wants to make these tokens that we've just seen, but instead of just, attacking with them, it wants to sacrifice them for value more than anything. And Aaron Benelia's Ruin shows you that. He can sack creatures to put a +1/+1 counter on your whole board. So he likes to have expendable bodies, but he also likes to have a lot of bodies, so that effect is as good as possible. There's also LS Ilkor, Sadistic Pilgrim, which likes it when creatures enter the battlefield, so it likes you going wide, but it also likes it when they leave the battlefield. It makes your opponent lose 1 life every time they do, so sacrificing your own stuff comes with extra value. And then your 4 kicker signpost cards are Banalish Sleeper, a 2-mana 3/1 that has a kicker of 1 black that makes both players sacrifice something. Usually you'll be in a better place to sacrifice things because your deck's built around it. You've got Phyrexian Missionary, which lets you return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So it helps, in a way, you go wide in the sense that you get 2 bodies out of this card in the end, and it lets you get back things that you might have sacrificed. You've also got Phyrexian Warhorse, who likes to sacrifice things to increase its stats, and when you kick it, it also gives you a second body. And then there's also Shieldred's Restoration, which lets you reanimate something. This one's a little interesting because I think it's actually a little more well-suited to the decks more interested in milling themselves, but it obviously works here too because, you're going to lose creatures, you're going to sacrifice creatures, and you can reanimate them with Shieldred's Restoration. So what are the sacrifice outlets and payoffs? Well, Aeron is a great one, as is Phyrexian Warhorse, as is Banalish Sleeper. On top of that, you've also got Braids' Frightful Return, which has a Chapter 1 that lets you give up a creature to make your opponent discard a card. It has a Chapter 2 that gives you back a creature, and then Chapter 3 can make your opponent sacrifice something. So it slots in nicely in this deck because this deck likes to sacrifice things and get things back from the graveyard. Gibbering Barricade is a sacrifice outlet that is, obviously it's on a defender, so if you end up in sort of a grindier version of this deck, it is appealing. You've got Phyrexian Vivisector, who anytime anything dies, or a creature you control dies, you scry 1, so that's basically a sacrifice payoff, but it likes it when anything of yours dies in any way. Singer Connoisseur gets a +1/+1 counter anytime 1 or more other creatures die. This one does include your opponent, but it only triggers once a turn. Bone Splinters is always great in this kind of deck because you're going to have all these extra soldier bodies, and it suddenly turns this sort of mediocre removal spell into something significantly better because you don't have to give up a real card and your opponent does. So what do you want to be sacrificing? Well, you of course have all of these token bodies that we've already discussed. Another token body to look at is Wingmantle Chaplain, especially if you end up in sort of a grindier version of the deck. We're going to see later in the video that there is a defender deck. There's an uncommon in white, an uncommon in black, and an uncommon in blue that are all pretty powerful defender payoffs, and this is the white one. But it does kind of slot into this deck too, especially if you happen to have 1 or 2 other defenders, because it does give you 2 bodies on its own, and if you have like Gibbering Barricade in your deck too, it suddenly gets more appealing. Sacrificing Cult Conscript is great because it can come back from your graveyard, and it also likes it when you sacrifice things because it can only come back if something has died during your turn. So it fits in great here. There's also LS Ilkor, who likes it when things die. Phyrexian Warhorse gives you the 2 bodies. Splatter Goblin, this isn't always great to sacrifice, but anytime you can sack this for value and then kill your opponent's X1, it does feel pretty good. Rares that slot in nicely here include Braids Arisen Nightmare, who has you sacrifice an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker during your end step if you want to, and if you do, your opponent has to sacrifice something of the same type or lose 2 life and let you draw a card, and you'll be in better shape here. You'll have these expendable bodies to sacrifice, so Braids will turn into a pretty crazy engine. There's also Ratadrabic of Urborg. You're not always going to have enough legendaries to really make it work, but if you have a few, they suddenly become kind of good sacrifice fodder because they all replace themselves with a 2/2 zombie body. So that's Black-White. Feels to me like it's sort of a grindier sacrifice deck that wants to outlast the opponent. Let's move now to Black-Red, which I think is a more aggressive sacrifice deck. Here you have Lagomos, Hand of Hatred, and Garna, Blood Fist of Keld. Lagomos gives you a 2/1 red elemental creature token of trample and haste every single turn. You can attack with that, but you could also sacrifice it for some value if you want to. And Lagomos also has an additional ability that's going to be hard to make happen, but this deck has enough synergy with sacrificing and stuff dying that you might occasionally actually get to Diabolic Tutor something with the tap effect, which is really good. And then Garna really likes it when your stuff dies, especially if it's attacking. You get to draw a whole card if one of your creatures you control dies while it's attacking. If it's not attacking, your opponent loses a life. So yeah, both of these signposts are really about attacking, getting a body and attacking in the case of Lagomos, and just attacking all the time in the case of Garna, because you're going to come out ahead. But there's a sacrifice angle here too. Balduvian Atrocity, for example, one of the kicker signposts, is a 3-mana 2/3 with menace with kicker for a red, and it can reanimate a small creature from the graveyard and give it haste until end of turn, and it can attack if you kick it. And that's pretty good. It also gives you an additional body to sacrifice to various effects. Aggressive Sabotage is really more about the aggressive angle for this deck, in the sense that it's a discard spell that can also be reached because it can do 3 to the opponent. Enthrall to the Pit. This card is always nice in these decks that have a sacrifice angle, because you can sacrifice the thing you steal, and this can actually do it internally if you ever get to 7 mana. And then Warhost's Frenzy gives you a powerful mass pump spell that if you kick it, makes it so when your creatures die that turn, you draw a card. So it's mostly about attacking and damaging the opponent, but also sacrificing things for some value. Again, sacrifice outlets and payoffs here. We've got the ones we've already seen. Gibbering Barricade, Phyrexian Warhorse, Braids' Frightful Return, the Vivisector, the Connoisseur. There's also Hurler's Cyclops, which can sack creatures to do 1 to any target. Garna, again, Bone Splinters, and so forth. So, a lot of the same stuff. There's a lot of overlap, as I said. You can see how a black-white and black-red deck could overlap with each other. Things you want to sacrifice include things we've already seen, like Cult Conscript and Lagomos, but also Balduvian Berserker, who does damage equal to its power when it dies. So if you can enlist it first and then sacrifice it, it's going to be nuts. The only sort of downside there is it does have to attack to enlist. So if it doesn't survive combat, you might not get the sweetest value, but same time, if it doesn't survive combat, it's still damaging something. Splatter Goblin again, Enthrall to the Pit again. Phoenix Chick is a nice thing to sacrifice because you can keep bringing it back if you're attacking with enough creatures. And the 2 bodies Balduvian Atrocity can give you is also nice alongside various sacrifice effects. Rares here, you've got Braids again. You've also got Squee, Dubious Monarch, who gives you 2 bodies, which are things you can sacrifice. But it's also just a nice aggressive 3-drop that if you do sacrifice Squee, you can also get it back later in the game. So let's move from this aggressive deck to the red-white one, which is a go wide aggro deck. It gets the aggro part from red and the go wide part from white. You've got 2 signposts and commons, Tori the Avenant Fury Rider, who can buff your whole board when it attacks and also untap things and give them trample depending on their color. And you've got Baird Argivian Recruiter, who cranks out a 1/1 soldier token any turn where you control a creature that has greater power than its base power. And that means that in some way or another, its power is augmented. The most obvious way to do that in this format is with Enlist, but you can do it with tricks. You can do it with +1/+1 counters and so forth. And then your signpost cards kicker cards include Cleaving Skyrider, who comes with a kick ability that lets you do X damage to any target where X is a number of attacking creatures. Heroic Charge, which has a more natural home here because you don't have to splash or anything to be able to kick it and give your stuff trample. Keldon Strike Team, which I think is a really key card for this particular deck, both because it gives you 3 bodies, which this deck likes, it wants to go wide, but also because it's a 3/1 with haste, and that haste means it can enlist, right away when it enters the battlefield. And there's definitely an enlist theme within the red-white color pair. Herloon Battle Hymn doesn't really fit the synergy of the rest of this at all. It's just a very, very good removal spell, but I have it here because it is the uncommon, signpost kicker card here. So commons and uncommons that help you go wide, they're the ones we've already seen, including also Captain's Call, Argivian Cavalier, and Enlist. Being a sub-theme does make the Cavalier even better here because of the fact that it's, a card that already makes 2 bodies, but there's also some extra reasons you want to enlist, like Baird. You've also got Resolute Reinforcements, Argivian Phalanx, Charismatic Vanguard. These are cards we saw earlier when talking about the blue-white go-wide deck. And again, you can see how blue-white and red-white could easily go together. Then there's the Enlist Synergy sub-theme you have here. We've got Baird, Keldon Strike Team, and the Herbalist. The Herbalist, when you tap it, does a thing, and that means it's pretty good for enlisting. Baird works well with Enlist, like I said, because it cranks out a token if you have a creature with higher power than its base power. And then the strike team, like I said, I think this is going to be a really key common for this deck. If you can get multiple strike teams, I think your deck is going to be pretty good, even in the absence of stuff like Baird, just because it is such a powerful play on turn 3 or turn 5 because of the various synergies within the color pair. So rares that fit in well here. You've got Jaya again. I have her here both because her +1 makes you tokens and because her -2 likes it when your creatures attack. Squeeze Good here gives you 2 bodies. Valiant Veteran, even better here than it is in a deck like Blue-White because there are a bunch of red soldiers too. It's sort of a secret signpost rare in that sense, even though it fits nicely in multiple other white decks. This is the white deck where it's at its best. I have Guardian of New Benalia here. It's going to be good in any white deck, but because of this color pair's Enlist sub-theme, I included it here. Defiler of Faith helps you go wide with tokens, and that's something this deck wants to do. So the remaining color pairs we have to talk about all have either a domain theme or sub-theme. And before we talk about those actual color pairs, I want to look at these cards because they're important. This is not all of these common dual lands. There are 10 of them in the set, but they're going to be particularly good in this kind of deck because this deck wants to have as many basic land types among lands as possible because you get lots of extra value. That's what domain checks for. And I said in the set review that I can see these being valued similarly to the way snowlands were valued in Kaldheim, and I still feel like that's going to be the case here. They're really going to power up the cards in these decks. They're going to make your fixing better. They're just going to be really important for these decks. I don't want to talk about them every time I talk about every domain deck, so I just wanted to put them here. Keep them in mind. Keep in mind that they are going to make domain easier to trigger, easier to get going than it is in most formats. All right, so let's start with green-white. It's another token deck because, of course, it has white in it. And the 2 signpost and commons that you have are Queen Alanal of Ruidoc, who really likes tokens. Her power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you control. And anytime you make 1 or more tokens, she also makes a 1/1 white soldier creature token. And then Zar Ojanen, Scion of Efravra, brings domain in, but it also likes for you to be going wide with tokens because it buffs your whole board based on what your domain is when it becomes tapped. That also means, by the way, you can use it with Enlist, which is pretty cool. And yeah, you really only need a domain of 2 to pump a bunch of tokens, but if you can get your domain higher, you can pump more and more of your board. In some ways, I do think this color pair seems a little less focused than some of the others, and I think you can see that to some extent with the kicker cards, especially the 2 white ones. Juniper Order, Rootweaver, and Shalai's Acolyte are both good, but they don't really do anything that's about going wide, really. So they're kind of nice cards to have, but they aren't really synergistic. Scout the Wilderness and Strength of the Coalition are. Scout the Wilderness can help you get domain by searching up a basic land and putting it onto the battlefield. And if you kick it, you also get 2/1/1 white soldier creature tokens. So you get to go wide and set up your domain. And Strength of the Coalition is a nice combat trick that's, normally 1 mana for +2/+2. But if you kick it, you put a +1/+1 counter on your whole board. So those 2 really make sense. Rootweaver and Acolyte make less sense, but they are good cards nonetheless. So, tokens. We've seen a lot of them already, and of course there's things like Captain's Call, Argivian Cavalier, Resolute Reinforcements, Scout the Wilderness. There's also the Weatherseed Treaty, which I think is particularly good here because it can both make you a creature token, and it also can set up domain, and then it has a domain payoff ability. So it slots in pretty nicely here. Llanowar Stalker is not a card I love, but if there's a deck for it, it's this, because you're going to be making tokens in multiple bodies. So this is the best green deck for it, really. Wingmantle Chaplain is here again. There's a defender theme in the set, like I said. This gives you 2 bodies on its own. If you can get a few more defenders in your deck, it gets even better. Love Song of Night and Day is another saga that gives you a body, a token, and it's not really a go-wide payoff, but you're likely to have 2 bodies to put +1/+1 counters on with Chapter 3 in this deck because you can go wide. So, domain. Not every domain card is going to be a nice fit for every domain deck, so I've sort of selected the ones that make the most sense in certain decks, and I've also included the cards here that can help you get domain, like Scout the Wilderness and the Weatherseed Treaty, which is both a domain payoff and a way to search up a land to get domain, and it makes a token. Gaia's Might is a nice cheap trick, and if you can consistently get your domain to 3+. It turns into Giant Growth, which is a powerful trick. Neshoba Brawler looks pretty good here because it's a 2-drop that gets bigger and bigger the higher your domain gets. Sunbathing Rootwalla, meanwhile, is a 2-drop that can buff itself based on your domain. You can see I don't have any white domain cards here, and that's because there's only one white domain card, and this is sort of the interesting thing, like I said earlier, that they did, where sometimes it's really only one color in a color pair that has one theme, and it's the other color that has the other theme, and that's sort of what we see here. White is mostly the tokens, green is mostly the domain. And the one white card with domain I don't think is particularly good. It's a removal spell that is very situational. So rares that fit in nicely here, you've got King Darien, of course. First of all, he buffs your whole board. You like that. Second of all, he can crank out tokens and make himself bigger. And third of all, he can actually give all of your tokens hexproof and indestructible if he sacrifices himself. Johnny's -3 is really good if you're going wide, especially if you can just sort of curve out, like play 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, or in any way have 3 bodies in play when you play a Johnny. If you can do that, play a Johnny, put a counter on each of them, and attack your opponent, they probably lose. Herd Migration is neat because you can cycle it effectively in the early game, pay 1 generic and a green, search up a land and gain 3 life, and that can help you set up domain. And then in the later stages of the game, you can cast it and get a bunch of tokens, bigger than most of the tokens in the format. It is probably a little better in the more ramp or mid-range oriented decks that are domain than this one, but it'll fit nicely anywhere. Llanowar Green Widow is a really efficient creature who can come back from the graveyard, and that cost is reduced based on domain. So that is green-white. It's domain go wide. Blue-green is domain ramp. It can sort of be a domain spells deck too, but this is one of the few instances where a blue deck is not a spell deck in the format because it's mostly focused on domain and ramp, as the name would suggest. Niall Avazoa Aeronaut is a 4-mana 2/4 flyer that anytime it hits your opponent, you get to look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. That's the domain thing. And then you get to put one of those on top of your library and the rest on the bottom. But if you have 5 basic land types, in other words, your domain is at maximum, you get to draw a card. And obviously that trigger also helps you set up domain if that's what you want to do, because you can make sure you're going to draw the right lands. You can also just use it to make sure you're going to draw, cards you want to draw, not necessarily setting up domain. And then Tatyova doesn't have anything to do with domain, but she does love lands and ramping, because once you play your 7th land, every time you play a land, you get a 3/3 elemental creature with haste. The land becomes that, and it has flying too because of her other ability. The kicker signpost cards here include Joint Exploration, which is sort of a build your own growth spiral. So it can help you ramp by letting you play an extra land in addition to helping you see a bunch of cards because you get to scry 2 and draw. Pixie Illusionist is a nice little creature because it's a reasonable-ish 1-drop, and then in the later game you can play it as a larger creature, but what really makes it synergize here is the fact that you can make your lands become the basic land type of your choice until end of turn, so she can increase your domain for a turn at least. Elvish Hydromancer, meanwhile, is a great thing to ramp into. When you have to pay 7 when you kick it, but when you do that, you get to make a token copy of one of your creatures, which is quite powerful. And then Vineshaper Prodigy, less synergistic than these other 3 cards, but it's just like a super good card. You can play it as a 2-mana 2/2, or you can pay 4 mana for a 2/2 that also lets you draw the best card from the top 3 cards of your library. So common and uncommon cards that have domain and that help you get domain that are well suited to this deck include, of course, Niall and Pixie Illusionist. The Weatherseed Treaty is part of that again, as is Scout the Wilderness. So, this is, again, an instance where it's easy to see these 3 colors overlapping. Scout the Wilderness will help any green deck get domain, but most of these decks are going to have the easiest time of playing multiple colors because they have access to things like Scout the Wilderness. So paying the off-color kicker on cards is really easy to do, and that's going to be a big theme, I think, for blue-green. It's going to be better at it than basically any other deck. You've also got Territorial Morrow. So, this is a domain card we haven't already talked about, and that's because I don't think it's going to be especially good in the more aggressive domain deck that we've looked at so far, because it's just a huge vanilla creature. But this deck is probably going to be the most adept of all of them at getting to a domain of 5, partly thanks to a card like Niall. And that means it's going to be a 5-mana 10/10 a reasonable chunk of the time, and obviously that's a reasonable thing to have in this deck. Slimefoot Survey, if there's a deck for it, if this format's slow enough for the survey to work, this is the deck for it, because this lets you pay 5 to search up 2 lands that each have a basic land type, and that means you could search up 2 of those dual lands, which can raise your domain. Usually, if you can cast this, you're probably going to get your domain to 5. On top of that, you also get to, reorganize the top of your library based on your domain. Floriferous Vine Wall, again, this didn't really fit in the more aggressive version of a domain deck because it's a 2-mana 0/2 with Defender, but it can help you find domain because it lets you get a land from the top 6. And Yavimaya Sojourner, probably better here too, because this deck's, again, going to be the best at really getting domain going. Ramping that doesn't involve domain or helping you get domain includes Deathbloom Gardener, 3-mana 1/1 that can tap for mana of any color, and Joint Exploration, which we already saw. Some of the stuff you can ramp into include Mossbeard Ancient, a huge 7-mana 7/7 trampler that gains you life, the Elvish Hydromancer, which we already saw, and something like Shalai's Acolyte. It's sort of a stand-in here for off-color cards that have one color that lines up with the core of your deck, because this deck is going to have an easy time like ramping into a kicked Shalai's Acolyte, which is quite an opposing creature. Rares for this deck include the Loam Speaker, who can give you mana, Vidalian Mindsinger, who's better the more mana you can pump into it, and Sphinx of Clear Skies, which has a domain effect that lets you sort of do a mini fact or fiction based on your domain. You've also got Herd Migration, which is probably much better here than in a green-white deck, because you're actually going to be ramping here and getting your domain high enough that it can be an absurd spell in the late game, in addition to it helping you get domain early. Lana War Green Widow, also going to be cheaper to bring back from the graveyard here. Our next domain deck is a graveyard-oriented one that, of course, adds black to the mix. Your 2 signpost uncommons are Bortuk Bone Rattle and Urg Spawn of Turg. Bortuk Bone Rattle gets you a creature card back from your graveyard when it enters the battlefield, and then if that creature has a mana value that is less than or equal to the number of basic land types among lands you control, you just get to put it into play. So this is a good card at really embodying this color pair. It likes to get domain going, but it really likes to abuse the graveyard for value, and that's really what Bortuk Bone Rattle does here. Urg Spawn of Turg, meanwhile, can help you mill cards into your graveyard, because at your upkeep you get to Surveil 1, effectively. You can also sack lands to gain life, and its power is equal to the number of lands in your graveyard. Here are Signpost Kicker cards. It's another instance where they're not super focused on either sort of element of the color pair, which in this case is graveyard and domain. The only one of these that really falls in that category is Urborg Repossession, which gets you a creature card back from your graveyard, and if you kick it, you get that creature and then another permanent, which is pretty nice. It's any permanent, not just creatures. Then the other cards you have are just like pretty good cards, like Choking Miasma. It sort of shows you this deck is something of a grindy control deck, I suppose, because it's a sweeper. And if you kick it, you get to put a counter on one of your creatures. Bog Badger can give menace to your whole board when you kick it, and Terra Sunder is just a great removal spell. So, graveyard stuff. We have these 2 signposts. Shadow Prophecy. This is probably the best deck for it because, first of all, this deck is sort of a grindier, slower deck that's interested in a 3-mana card that doesn't necessarily add to the board, and it has a domain-related effect, and it helps you load the graveyard because you get to look at the top X cards of your library, where X is your domain count, and you get to put 2 of them into your hand and the rest into the graveyard. There's also, of course, Urborg Repossession. There's also Writhing Necromass, which likes creatures in the graveyard. Tribute to Urborg. This is another sort of off-color kicker you can run. You're going to be milling yourself and putting things in your graveyard, so this slots in pretty well here too, provided you're splashing blue, which shouldn't be very hard. This is where I think Shieldred's Restoration is probably a little better, because this deck is better at milling itself than the black-white one is. So this is another off-color kicker card you can run. Monstrous Warleech, same thing. You can pay the blue kicker in this deck without too much trouble, and it mills you, and it's a mill payoff. You've also got Eerie Soul Tender, which mills you and can bring back things. Sometimes you mill something you don't want to mill, it can get it back. And Cult Conscript. You're not going to be sacrificing it here like in the other decks, but you can mill it and then get it back pretty easily. You're not going to be as good at just sort of making it so it can come back every single turn, because you're not a sacrifice deck so much, but you can get it back, and that's nice. Rares that are well suited here, you've got Urborg Lurgoyf, who mills you a bunch when it enters the battlefield and has power equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard, and toughness equal to that number +1. Lana War Green Widow, this will be the deck the best at bringing it back from the graveyard, because it likes to put things in the graveyard to begin with. Herd Migration, good here too. You can use it to help you get domain early, and then in the later game it can make a bunch of bodies. And we also have Cruelty of Gix again. Chapter 3 is a reanimation spell, works well here. And our last of these 2 color pairs is red-green, which is also our last domain deck, and it's a more aggressive domain deck. It's a deck with a bunch of big, beefy creatures, but also creatures who are lower on the curve. It can win the game both in the early game and in the mid game. And your domain theme and your aggro theme is embodied quite well by Rada, Coalition Warlord, who, when she becomes tapped, another target creature you control gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. So you can see she's only buffing one thing, so she's not as into going wide. This deck is more into having 1 or 2 really big creatures a lot of the time, especially with trample or other evasion, and Rada helps you do it. Ruluk Mons is your other legendary signpost, and when it attacks, it can either ramp you, if you reveal a land card from the top of your library, or give you a 1/1 red goblin creature token. Your signpost kicker cards here all fit very nicely into these themes. Viashino Branch Rider can be a 1-mana 1/1 with haste with upside, or if you kick it, it becomes a larger creature. Sprouting Goblin helps you search your library for a basic land when you kick it, which can help you set up domain, and it can also give up lands to draw you cards. Colossal Growth is a powerful combat trick that can give +4/+4 and trample when you kick it, so it can really allow, let's say, a creature you buffed with Rada, Coalition Warlord, to do a ton of damage. And Yavimaya Iconoclast is just a super efficient creature. Good on turn 2 as a 3/2 with trample, and good on turn 3 as a 4/3 with trample and haste. So domain stuff here, you of course have Rada. Again, you're more interested in sort of the cheap creatures and the combat tricks that have domain than you are in some of the grindier stuff that we saw in the blue-green deck, for example. So you like the Rootwalla, you like Gaia's Might, you like Nishoba Brawler. There's also Miria's Outrider, which is not a card that I love, but it does, give you some reach. Like if you can get your domain to 4 or 5, and this is sort of at the top of your curve, obviously it's going to close out some games. There's really only one rare that's like ultra well suited to this deck, and that's Rada's Firebrand. It's a 2-mana 3/1. Makes things unable to block, and it comes with a domain effect that increases its power, which makes it better at keeping things from blocking. So, like I said, those are the 10 2-color decks in the format, and again, there's going to be a lot of overlap. There's a lot of overlapping themes. The big themes really are sort of like spells, graveyard, domain, go wide, and a lot of those decks overlap with one another, and that's pretty cool. It's going to be a fun format. I think it looks like a well-designed one, but we're not quite done yet, actually, because we still have one more deck to take a quick look at, and that is the Defender deck, which will mostly be an Esper deck. So the only one of these we actually saw within this archetype guide so far is the Wingmantle Chaplain, which will fit decently into any one of the token or go wide decks, but these 3 uncommons here, Wingmantle Chaplain, Coral Colony, and Blight Pile, are all very real Defender payoffs. So if you can get a critical mass of Defenders in your deck, these can win you the game. Wingmantle Chaplain makes a bunch of tokens, Coral Colony can mill your opponent out, and Blight Pile can make your opponent lose life. It's kind of like Vent Sentinel. And then you have a couple of commons, or a couple of colorless cards rather, one of which is common, that helps support the deck. Shield Wall Sentinel can search you up your Defender payoffs, which is really nice, because if you're playing the Sentinel, you already have one Defender, and if you already have one Defender, all of these cards are way better. And then there's Walking Bulwark, the card out of all of these that I think is kind of the best in a vacuum, without any other defenders. But he can also make all these defenders lose defender, gain haste, and do damage equal to their toughness. So I do think the Defender deck looks real. Because it's reliant on these uncommons, it's not going to come together all the time. Maybe sort of like a Shrine deck for comparison. But I mean, if you have like 5 defenders and a couple of them are these Defender payoffs, you can build what is you're probably going to want to be a more grindy control deck if that's where you're headed, because obviously your creatures mostly can't attack and you want to make the game go long so you can win with all this Defender nonsense. But it does look like a pretty real deck. Won't come together as easily as the 10 main archetypes, but it's definitely something to keep in mind in the format. So that is my rundown of all the archetypes in Dominaria United Limited. Even though the set review is over now, there's plenty more content to come, including a video tomorrow on the top 10 bombs in the format. In addition to that, I'll be talking about this format in a weekly vlog for the next several weeks, and posting a ton of draft videos. So if you want to stay aware of all that content, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch the rest of this set review, you will see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.